12 years into raising my daughter, a lab technician asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether I was aware that the compatibility panel for my kidney donation had also run a paternity marker, standard protocol for related donor transplants, and whether I wanted the full results or just the transplant-relevant summary. My name is Desmond, and I said, without thinking twice, just give me everything. That single sentence is the reason I know what I know now. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. My daughter, Junie, was diagnosed with a rare kidney condition when she was 9, one that had, by the time she turned 12, progressed to the point where her nephrologist began seriously discussing transplant as the eventual, likely necessary path forward. I want to tell you that the 3 years between diagnosis and this story is its own entire saga of appointments, dialysis logistics, and the specific, grinding fear that comes with watching your child's body slowly struggle against something you cannot fix through sheer will alone, no matter how much you want to. I got tested as a potential donor almost immediately after transplant became a real conversation, roughly 8 months before this story starts. My wife, Petra, was tested too, along with a couple of extended family members, standard practice for maximizing the odds of finding a compatible match. I want to be honest that I was, in that period, functioning almost entirely on adrenaline and a specific, singular determination. I would be a match, I told myself, repeatedly, as though sheer conviction could influence blood typing. When the initial results came back showing I was, in fact, compatible, blood type and preliminary markers aligning well enough to move forward to the full workup, I remember the specific, overwhelming relief of that phone call, crying in my car in a hospital parking garage for probably 10 straight minutes before I could compose myself enough to drive home and tell Petra. The full donor workup happens in stages: blood work, imaging, psychological evaluation, more blood work, a genuinely exhaustive process designed to make sure a donor is both medically and psychologically prepared for the surgery. I was about 6 weeks into that process, at an appointment for what I understood to be a fairly routine follow-up panel, when the technician, a woman I'd seen at 3 or 4 previous appointments by that point, someone I'd built a small, friendly rapport with over the preceding weeks, mentioned, almost in passing while reviewing my chart, that the related donor compatibility panel included a paternity confirmation marker, just standard for related donors, to make sure the genetic relationship is properly documented for the transplant team's records, and asked whether I wanted the full detailed report or just the transplant-relevant summary that would go to my daughter's care team. I want to describe the exact several seconds that followed, because I think they matter enormously to understanding how completely, instantly my entire understanding of my own life reorganized itself. I had never, not once, in 12 years, had a single reason to question whether Junie was biologically mine. She had my mother's exact laugh. She had, everyone always said, my stubborn chin. I had been in the delivery room. I had cut the cord. There was, from where I stood, absolutely nothing about the last 12 years that had ever suggested any question needed asking at all. Give me everything, I said, mostly out of a vague, unthinking instinct toward wanting complete information rather than any specific suspicion, the kind of reflexive answer you give when a question catches you slightly off guard and you default to the most thorough option available. She told me the full report would come through the patient portal within a few days, along with the rest of the compatibility panel, and I honestly didn't think much more about it in the moment. My mind was mostly occupied, as it had been for months, with Junie's declining lab numbers and the growing urgency of getting the transplant scheduled. For days later, the portal notification came through on my phone while I was at work. I want to walk you through exactly what I saw, in the order I saw it, because it did not arrive as one clean piece of information. It arrived the way medical portals always deliver things: clinical, unadorned, buried inside a PDF full of numbers I mostly didn't understand, except for one line, near the bottom of the second page, under a section header that read paternity probability assessment, that I understood with a completeness that made the rest of the document blur out of focus entirely. Probability of biological paternity, 0%. Excluded. I read that line probably 15 times, sitting at my desk, my coworkers moving around me in the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while my entire life quietly detonated in complete silence. Excluded. Not inconclusive. Not further testing recommended. Excluded, with the specific, clinical finality of a test that had run against my actual genetic material and found zero possible match. I want to tell you what I did next, because it moved fast, and it did not stop revealing worse and worse things the longer I looked. I called the genetics counselor listed on the report, needing, somehow, to hear a human voice confirm what the document was already telling me in unambiguous terms. some part of me still hoping for an error, a mix-up, a lab mistake. She was kind, careful, clearly experienced in delivering this exact kind of devastating incidental finding, apparently common enough, in donor compatibility testing specifically, that she had a whole practiced, gentle protocol for it, and she confirmed, directly, that the testing methodology used had an error rate low enough to be considered essentially conclusive. There had been no mix-up. Junie was not, biologically, my daughter. I sat in my car in the office parking lot for close to an hour after that call, unable to make myself drive, replaying 12 years of memories that were suddenly, sickeningly, recontextualized in real time. The ultrasounds I'd attended, believing completely I was watching my own child. The specific way people always said Junie had my chin, a genetic fact I now understood to be, at best, an enormous coincidence. Every single first day of school, every scraped knee, every bedtime story, 12 years of fatherhood built on a fact I had never once had reason to question, and that had, apparently, never actually been true. I called Petra that evening, my voice, I'm told, coming out flatter and more controlled than I actually felt, because some part of me needed to hear whatever she said next without the conversation collapsing immediately into raw emotion. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know Junie isn't biologically mine? The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely, for a moment, wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of its earlier ordinary evening tone, replaced by something careful, quiet, and unmistakably afraid. Where did you hear that? The donor workup ran a paternity panel. It came back excluded. Petra, did you know? Another silence, shorter this time, but confirming enough on its own that I already had my answer before she said a single additional word. I need to tell you something, she said finally. And I need you to let me get through it before you say anything. Because if you stop me, I don't think I'll be able to start again. What followed, once she got home that evening, was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life, delivered in halting, reluctant pieces over nearly 3 hours, and it did not stop escalating for the entirety of it. Roughly a year before Junie was born, Petra told me she'd had a brief relationship with a coworker, overlapping, and this is the detail that made something in my chest go genuinely, physically cold, with the exact window during which Junie was conceived. She had, she said, genuinely believed, at the time of the pregnancy, that the timing made it more likely the baby was mine, based on her own calculation of dates, and had made a decision, consciously, deliberately, 12 years ago, to simply never raise the possibility with me at all, choosing instead to let me believe, completely, and without qualification, that Junie was unambiguously my biological child. You knew there was a chance, I said, and you let me believe there wasn't one. For 12 years. I convinced myself it didn't matter, she said. You were her father in every way that actually counted. I told myself the biology was just a technicality, and the longer it went without ever coming up, the more true that felt. And I never found a version of telling you that didn't feel like it would destroy everything. So I kept not telling you, year after year, until it just became the thing I decided I was never going to say. I want to be completely clear about something, because I think it matters enormously to how I've processed everything since. Nothing about that conversation changed how I felt about Junie herself, not even slightly, not for one single second. She is my daughter. 12 years of showing up, of loving her, of being present for every part of her life that a father is supposed to be present for, does not become less real or less true because of a lab result. I want that on the record clearly, because I think it's easy, in stories like this, to let the shock of the discovery overshadow the actual, unchanged truth of the relationship itself. What did change completely and irrevocably was how I understood my marriage, and specifically how I understood the 12 years of silence that had sat underneath it the entire time. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because the story kept escalating even after that initial 3-hour conversation. I asked Petra, directly, whether the coworker, whose name, I learned, was Malcolm, had ever known there was a possibility Junie was his. She told me no, that she'd never told him anything, that as far as she understood, he'd moved away from the area not long after their relationship ended, and, to her knowledge, had no idea Junie existed at all. I want to be honest that I don't fully know how to feel about that particular detail. Even now, some part of me finds it almost more unsettling than if he'd known, because it means an entire third person's life had been quietly, permanently shaped around a secret they never even had the chance to know they were part of. The transplant, meanwhile, could not simply pause for the emotional catastrophe unfolding around it. Junie's declining kidney function did not care that her parents' marriage was collapsing in real time. And I want to tell you that continuing to move forward with donor testing, coordinating surgical scheduling, managing the entire enormous logistical weight of a live organ transplant, while simultaneously processing the discovery that I wasn't biologically related to the child I was trying to save, was one of the strangest, most compartmentalized periods of my entire life. I had to hold both things at once, devastated by what I'd learned about my marriage, and more determined than ever to be there for Junie in exactly the way I always had been, because none of what I'd learned changed the fact that she needed me, specifically, showing up, exactly as I always had. I want to tell you the part of this story that I think matters most, because it's the part that surprised me. I was, ultimately, not the biological match Junie needed. The excluded result meant, obviously, that whatever compatibility the earlier preliminary panel had suggested was based on a genetic relationship that simply didn't exist, and the full donor workup, once corrected for the actual facts, showed I was not, in fact, a viable donor after all. It was Petra's brother, tested later in the process once my own donation was ruled out, who turned out to be a strong match, and who ultimately donated the kidney Junie needed, in a surgery that took place about 4 months after that Tuesday afternoon in my car in the parking garage. I stayed married to Petra through the transplant itself, and I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. Junie needed both of us, functioning, present, unified enough to get her through the hardest medical period of her life. And I made a deliberate, conscious decision to hold the marriage together through that specific window, not because I'd forgiven what I'd learned, but because I understood that my daughter's recovery could not wait for my own process to catch up. I filed for divorce about 5 months after the transplant. Once Junie was stable, recovering well, settled into a new post-surgery routine that no longer required the same intensity of constant medical crisis management. I want to be clear that the divorce was entirely about the 12 years of concealment, not about Junie's biology itself. I made sure, throughout the entire process, that both Petra and I were unified in communicating to Junie that nothing about our divorce had anything to do with her, that she remained, unconditionally, both of our daughter in every way that mattered. I pursued, and eventually secured, full legal recognition of my parental rights going forward, a process that exists specifically for situations like mine, where a non-biological parent has functioned as a child's actual father for the entirety of her life. And I want to tell you that the day that paperwork finalized, formally, legally confirming what had always been true in every practical sense, was one of the only unambiguously good days in this entire long, difficult year. I started therapy about 2 months after the initial discovery, once the acute crisis of the transplant scheduling had settled enough to leave room for it. My therapist has helped me understand something I didn't have language for in those first disorienting weeks. That grieving a genetic relationship you never actually had is its own strange, specific category of loss. One that doesn't erase the real relationship underneath it, but does require you to sit with a kind of retroactive vertigo. Every memory, every milestone, recontextualized without actually being invalidated, a distinction that took me a long time to be able to hold clearly in my own head. I think, more than anything, about that lab technician's offhand question, full report or transplant summary, and how close I came to simply saying, just give me the summary. The more common, less thorough answer, the one that would have let me continue, indefinitely, believing what I'd believed without complication for 12 straight years. I think about the version of this story where I never learn any of it, where I donate a kidney that would have turned out, upon final cross-match testing before surgery, to be a genetic non-match anyway, triggering the same discovery through a different, perhaps even more chaotic route, closer to the actual surgical date, with far less time to process it before Junie needed us both functioning at our absolute best. It's been just over 2 years now since that Tuesday. My mother said something to me about 6 months after the divorce finalized that I still think about often. She said, "You didn't lose a daughter, Desmond. You never had less of one than you thought you did. What you lost was a wife who decided, 12 years ago, that you didn't deserve the truth, and kept deciding that, year after year, right up until a lab test decided it for her instead." I didn't fully absorb that at the time. I was still too deep inside the exhaustion of the entire ordeal. I absorb it more now, 2 years out, Junie healthy and thriving on the other side of a successful transplant, my relationship with her completely, entirely unchanged in every way that actually matters. If you've ever had a piece of medical or genetic information arrive sideways, incidentally, as part of some entirely different process, and completely rearrange your understanding of your own family in the process, I want to hear about it. I think there's something particularly strange about the specific way modern medicine sometimes surfaces these truths not through confrontation or suspicion, but through routine, clinical protocol, a box checked on a form that ends up changing everything. 12 years. One donor panel. That's all it took to learn that a truth I never once thought to question had been sitting quietly underneath my entire family the whole time.